Hey there, Midas Letter subscribers, viewers, traders, and investors. I've got a special guest today. JR Rahn joins me now. He's the founder of MindMed, Inc., trading on NASDAQ under the symbol. JR, what is the symbol on the company on NASDAQ? I always get them confused.
MNMD on the NASDAQ.
Perfect. All right, JR, so it's been a while since we've chatted, and anybody who's been following the company as a result of our coverage has obviously done very well as by their investment at this point. And since moving to NASDAQ, your company has sort of taken on a sort of kind of momentum that implies that there are a lot better and bigger futures ahead than we see even right before us now. So give us an update on what's happening, what's driving the momentum behind MindMed at this point.
Yeah, just come to think of it, it was like literally the day before the pandemic started. I was sitting with you in Toronto. You were one of the first guys to really start covering us very early on, and we're the little engine that could. And now we're on the NASDAQ. Yeah, I mean, I think the momentum really, James, is a response to a misallocation of capital towards mental health. Right? We are coming out of this pandemic with a lot of folks sitting around in a four-walled box in cities, and mental illness and addiction are at all-time highs. Right, 40% of the United States has some form of a mental illness or addiction. That's a pretty large addressable market, and so I think from an investment standpoint, there are folks that have realized that, wow, we probably need to do something about our mental health and mental health care system. And I think there's a lot of institutional investors that see the long-term sustainability of this market. This is very much psychedelics are focused on a healthcare market, right? This is a drug development FDA pathway.
Right. Interesting. So the whole business proposition of MindMed depends quite heavily on the regulatory environment governing these psychedelic substances. So everybody always asks me, they're like, well, so what? So who's actually participating in these? Like, who's doing these experiments? Who's participating in them? How do they find them? So what sort of is your research environment look like? How do you move this whole thing forward?
Yeah, so we sort of have a very unique platform in that we take an approach of discover, develop, and deploy. So right now we're in that discover and develop component or phase of our company. So I'll just cover briefly what those means. Discover is really looking at how do we create novel forms of psychedelics or some new formulation or new way of administering psychedelics. And then the development component is when we actually translate any of that novelty over to a commercial development program that we're going to be bringing, for example, through the FDA. And so I think this is a key thing to focus on. Drug development takes time. It's not something that, is immediate. You have an immediate results month to month or day to day, like some businesses. However, if you can get an approval, there's some defendability in your business for a specific indication under the FDA pathway. But to take a drug from, for example, discovery all the way to approval, you could look at anywhere from an 8 to 12 year horizon. So there's a bunch of little companies that are looking at the discovery side, right? And those are sort of like very early stage stuff. Our approach has been, let's focus on the classic psychedelics that we see fairly good anecdotal evidence. There's some clinical evidence from maybe the 50s on LSD, for example, or recent research. And let's focus on getting those to market as soon as possible. And so in order to do that, we need to do phase 2 and phase 3 studies at the FDA. So that's going to be our approach. Focus on getting, for example, Project Lucy, which is looking at anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder with high doses of LSD, and moving that to a potential approval. we're also going to be looking at how do we formulate new forms of LSD and new forms of mescaline and MDMA. But I think we have to have this sort of comprehensive pipeline and portfolio.
Yeah, you bet. Well, so that's interesting to me. You know, as a lifelong pursuer of alternative realities afforded by psychedelics, I mean, I credit my general state of well-being, which I'm a very happy person. Everybody always says, you know what, James, tone it down a bit. It's too early in the morning for that level of happiness. I credit that directly to my psychedelic experiences. So I mean, I believe in it anecdotally before the FDA even completes its process, which is what excites me so much about the psychedelic realm. If so many more people had the exposure to it as I was lucky enough to, then there would be much less mental illness and therefore all of the problems that come with it. So that's great. Let me ask you this. How does what you do compare with what Compass Pathways does? Because everybody looks at MindMed and says, is this the next Compass Pathways, you know, trading at $35 a share? How does what you do compare with what they do?
Well, Compass, to my knowledge, is focused on a single molecule in a single indication, treatment-resistant depression, which is a big market, and they're using psilocybin, right? So that is their main drug product, or as they refer to it, COMP360. I think they have that sort of singular focus, like let's get psilocybin to market, and we applaud those efforts. I think it's good to have focus. At the same time, we think that there's a bigger opportunity by having a more diverse pipeline, because some of these trials are going to work out and some of them aren't. And so if you're only focused on one substance and one indication, that in many ways could be risky for a company. And so our approach is go a little bit wider. Focus on some later stage clinical trials. So we have Project Lucy using LSD. There's a lot of folks that are working on psilocybin. That was one thing that we realized when we started assembling our portfolio. Very few people working on LSD. And so we were able to acquire multiple phase 1 and a phase 2 clinical trial from the University Hospital Basel's Liechti lab, which is one of the leading research labs on LSD in the world, and really start filing some IP against some of that research, but also use it to translate into new programs. And so they had a phase 2 anxiety trial, and it's still ongoing, that we were able to look at, assess, and understand, and move it. We then took that information and set up a commercial drug trial at the FDA, a phase 2B, called Project Lucy, that's looking at generalized anxiety disorder. We also have many other programs that we're looking at. We're looking at pain. We just announced Project Angie, which right now the opioid crisis is ravaging America, right? They estimates that it is costing us, the United States, $500 billion a year. And opioids actually aren't necessarily solving the underlying cause of pain. Pain is ultimately a signal, and they're really just masking it, much like Xanax does for anxiety. And so we're trying to understand if there is a new paradigm here in treating pain by dealing with what is that underlying cause. So in addition to that, we're looking at the addiction treatment space. We have a molecule called 18MC, which is looking at opioid withdrawal and opioid addiction. So all of these sort of compound and actually coalesce in many ways, because we see tons of comorbidity between indications here, right? Like somebody that has anxiety might also have ADHD, and there's a high prevalence of that. And the same could be thought of anxiety and depression. Ultimately, as my chief medical officer, Dr. Dan Carlin, says, the entire world has anxiety. We know one certainty in this world, probably besides taxes, which is death. And so that is something that we need to consider. And I think that's why anxiety is so much our lead asset as we move forward here.
Right, you bet. Okay, JR, so then from an investor's perspective, They want to know what are the big milestones that you're going to hit this year that are going to be representative of success towards your ultimate objectives.
Well, I think for any drug development company, you need to make sure that trials are starting and they're expanding the pipeline. And so I think we've demonstrated that. I think the sort of big moments will be end of Q3 for us as we open the IND, ideally with the FDA. We just got back a Type C meeting response from FDA on saying, we're supportive of generalized anxiety disorder. You should submit your IND application, and then we'll render, whether the trial can start or not. And so we'd ultimately like to scale up Project Lucy in Q4, subject to the IND being approved by the FDA. We're also going to have other study starts for microdosing of LSD and an adult ADHD study. It's a proof of concept study. There's a big craze around microdosing. We just didn't feel there was enough clinical evidence. So we wanted to really look at, can microdosing work? So there's multiple study starts. Those are all on our website. I think those are going to be the main drivers. In addition, MindMed has really started, we're in discover and develop, but we need to start thinking about deploy. We're unique from a traditional biotech company in that, in many ways, MindMed might have to build some of the infrastructure to ultimately launch and scale our drug if we want to make it into a blockbuster drug. We're not necessarily going to be sending out LSD through Walgreens. We're going to have to amalgamate a network of therapists and psychiatrists that are ultimately going to administer these drugs, because in America, doctors deliver care. I come from the tech industry, and ultimately what we saw was we need to build technology platforms that are going to scale access to disenfranchised communities. To 60% of US counties don't have a psychiatrist present. So we have to think about scalability. And so that's a big thing of what we're working on in our Albert division, which is our technology division. And so I look on telling a bit more about how that platform is unfolding and what software we're developing. Ultimately, I see that MindMed is going to be as much a technology company as it is a drug development company. And I think that's something quite unique. People sort of think a lot of times in the drug development and pharma industry of technology as an afterthought. We're building it right now into the core of our DNA. And that, I think, is going to ultimately be very powerful if we're able to get a drug approved, so that we can launch it and scale it.
Perfect. All right, JR, we're going to leave it there for now. I really thank you for your time today. I look forward to talking to you soon again in the future. Have a fantastic day.
Thanks, James.